Yeah, my training initially is in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience, and I think that's where I come from in terms of a disciplinary orientation. But I'm very interested in applying concepts from cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience to see how we can improve education or instruction broadly in multiple contexts. So, you know, I like to think of myself as trying to work in Pasteur's quadrant, both applied and basic research questions together. So the title of my talk today is Relational Reasoning and Relational Complexity in Curricular Knowledge Components. And yeah, please let me know at any time if there's any sound or picture issues. Okay, I'm going to start by breaking down that title a little bit. I'll explain what I mean when I say a knowledge component, and then what is meant by relational complexity, how relational complexity affects learning of knowledge components. You guys can see my laser pointer, right? Okay. And is there any data to support this idea? And finally, moving out into some broader implications. So how does knowing about relational complexity of knowledge components, how can that actually inform instruction? So this term knowledge components comes from the, this should be reversed, Knowledge Learning Instruction KLI framework, excuse me, of Kadinger, Corbett, and Perfetti. And they define knowledge component as an acquired unit of cognitive function or structure that can be inferred from performance on a set of related tasks. In other words, it's something that we want people to learn if we're educators, some unit of the curriculum. It could be a fact, it could be a concept, it could be a skill, and so forth. And if you've read this paper, you know they go into a great deal of detail in breaking down what different types of knowledge components can be and what the implications of knowing that are. For the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to touch on their taxonomy of knowledge components a little bit. I'm not going to get all the way into it. But one of the main distinctions that they make is between constant condition knowledge components and variable condition knowledge components. So a constant condition knowledge component is something where you have basically a one-to-one mapping. When you see a certain prompt or question, you'll always produce the same response. So one curricular example could be considered knowing state capitals. So here are US state capitals. Given a state, you just have to recall the capital. There's no underlying logic. It's simply basically a paired associate situation. You can even think of it as a lookup table in terms of how it might be represented. Similarly, people say, think sometimes that arithmetic facts, when they're well learned, are represented in a sort of lookup table, right? So it's just a matter of recalling the facts, right? Given a certain stimulus, 4 plus 3, go into your table, you look up the response, 7, you bring it back. That doesn't necessarily involve any relational or schematic knowledge of mathematics. I apologize for my voice. The pollen count has been killing me this week. In the KLI framework, they also refer to variable condition knowledge components, and these are obviously the kind that I find interesting because they include categories, rules, schemas, or principles. So you can't just learn a one-to-one mapping. Here are some curricular examples. For English speakers, to learn the articles in Spanish, you have to learn at minimum a one-to-many mapping, and there are these conditionals that you have to keep in mind. Is it masculine? Is it feminine? Is it singular? Is it plural? Whereas in English, we only have to think about singular and plural. Any rule in geometry would be a good example of a knowledge component. And you can also think of sets of rules together acting as a schema that might be something that you want someone to learn. or even something like steps in the scientific method, right? Understanding that these are in an order, how one step contributes to the next, what are the implications, so on and so forth. So these are just some examples of variable condition knowledge components, and I'm sure you can think of more. So in the original paper, they do touch on the issue of complexity a little bit, and they state that variable condition knowledge components are more complex than constant condition knowledge components, and that in particular the variable, which is in their taxonomy, type of knowledge components map one relational structure to another, and variables are used to express the many possible arguments to those relations. So we have relational structure, arguments to those relations, and since this is a relational reasoning audience, that's probably raising some flags of interest for you. But I think we can infer from what they've said here that relational knowledge components are more complex than non-relational ones. Okay, so what do I mean by relational complexity? Well, let's start by talking about what a relation is. So here's probably a familiar example from Markman and Gentner. Here we have a food bank bringing food to a woman. We have a woman giving food to a squirrel. And you can see the woman says thank you, but the squirrel does not. We'll ignore that for the moment. And we can actually describe the relation this way, right? So there's a parallel here between the woman feeds the squirrel and the food bank feeds the woman. And you guys are probably familiar with this type of representation for a relation or a relational structure. There are lots of different models for representing relations, especially computational type of models. I'm going to use Dora here, not because I'm particularly an adherent of it, but just because I think it highlights some of the issues that I want to make clear. So what I want to highlight is this idea of roles. So in the relation, Fido is bigger than Sarah. Fido takes the role of larger, Sarah takes the role of smaller. And one of the things about the Dora model, I think that differentiates it from other models is that it specifically includes role binding units. So the role and the entity have to be bound in order for the relation to be parsed. And so with our example from above, we would see that the woman in the bottom panel has to be bound, so the entity woman has to be bound to the role of donor, and the entity squirrel has to be bound to the role of recipient. But what is both great and interesting and also difficult about relations is that they can be represented abstractly, right? So the idea is that you can put in different entities or different arguments into these roles. So you can actually represent the relation abstractly without particular entities. And this is what allows transfer, this is what allows structural alignment, this is what allows abstraction. So even though I've used Dora, most or all of the models include some idea of roles and binding specific entities into roles, and then a relation. And the roles, entities have to be bound into roles for the relation to be parsed. There can be conditions. Not every entity can take every role. Sometimes the relation is commutative, so you can reverse the role. So for example, if the relation is siblings, you can reverse which entity is in which role, and it doesn't make a difference. Whereas other ones, for example, this feeds one or brother of, sister of, may not be commutative. And most of the ones we tend to talk about are not commutative in that way. Okay. So that's a relation, and you'll see in a little bit why I stress this idea of the roles and the role binding, which I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. But relational complexity can we actually quantify it? So Halford et al. Proposed a metric for relational complexity based on what they called, well, what's called arity. In other words, the number of entities in a relation that must be considered in parallel. And that in parallel part is important, and I'll come back to that. Excuse me. But for example, if a relation involves 2 entities or 2 roles, then it's binary, 3 roles, ternary, and number of roles, n-ary. And so this is where you get that arity term. Yeah, okay. So here's one example. If you have X is taller than Y, Bob is taller than Tom, this is a binary relation. It has lower complexity than a ternary relation, such as Bob is taller than Tom is taller than Peter, right? There's this monotonically taller relation. And this is where I want to go back to this point in parallel. There we go, okay. Chunking and segmentation can reduce relational complexity. So if you are only processing things in serial, that doesn't necessarily make the relation more complex. Okay. And right, so here, you know, I have put in specific entities, Bob, Tom, and Peter, into these roles, but keep in mind that when we're talking about the arity or the relational complexity, it's the number of roles or slots or dimensionality. In other words, it's the number of variables. So these are things that could change, right? Because when a relation is represented abstractly, there's no particular entity bound into that role. Okay, I may be beating a dead horse here. Please excuse me. Okay. We know that relational reasoning ability increases across developmental time. In other words, older kids and adults are better at it than younger kids. We also know about the demands that it makes on the brain. So here's an experiment. This is from Xiao et al. Where using a relational complexity metric very similar to Halford's definition, they compare people doing a 0 relational task to a 1 or unary relation task. Well, and here comparing a 2-level, more relationally complex task to a non-relational task, basically. And what's interesting here is you see basically a frontoparietal network. If anybody here does any math work, this is very nice identification of the IPS here, intraparietal sulcus. And this tickles me a little bit because in our work with fractions, we see almost an identical network when we have participants doing fraction comparisons. So a little foreshadowing there. But if you look, so this is just relational versus non-relational, and you can see regardless of the level of relational complexity, you see the same network. But if you compare specifically a higher relational complexity to a lower relational complexity, what pops out here is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which we know is involved in things like working memory and online processing. And this, along with behavioral data, supports this idea that increased relational complexity requires greater working memory resources. And then that ties back to what I was saying about chunking and segmentation. To the extent that you can chunk parts of a relation, you can lower the working memory demands and, in a sense, lower the effective relational complexity. Okay. I'll pause for a moment here. Are there any questions to clarify anything at this time?
I don't think so. I don't see questions in the chat.
Okay, great. Thank you. So now I'll just give a couple of examples of, again, looking at realistic items or knowledge components from a curriculum. How would we apply this idea of relational complexity? So one example could be if you consider the gas laws that you learn as a chemistry student in high school. You learn Boyle's law, pressure times volume equals some constant. So basically, if the pressure goes up, the volume goes down. If the volume goes up, the pressure goes down, because they have to maintain this constant. Similarly, for Charles' law, which relates volume and temperature, keeping in a constant ratio. And if you look at each of these, they're arguably a binary or ternary if you consider the constant relation. So the two things that could change that you have to think about in relation to each other are these two variables in each of these cases. But then after you learn these, you learn the ideal gas law, PV equals nRT, and you can see what each part stands for there. R here is a constant, so I wouldn't consider it contributing to the relational complexity. But here, now we have 4 different moving parts. You have to consider pressure, volume, number of moles, and temperature. So changing any one of these could change the others. And since we have 4 here, this is arguably, if we consider these of binary complexity, we could consider this quaternary. So here's an example where we can identify a difference in relational complexity in some curricular knowledge components. So I'm just trying to play out the idea to get us a little familiar with it. Another example is in classifying shapes. The taxonomy or the hierarchy for quadrilaterals is actually a little more complex than we tend to think about. First, you have to think about, are there any parallel sides? Then are the sides the same length? Then are the sides right angles or not? So in fact, a square is a rectangle, but a square is also a rhombus, a square is also a parallelogram, and a square is also a quadrilateral. So you have, these are actually nested categories, and to classify a square, you actually have to go 3 steps down into this hierarchy. In contrast, if you take the classification of triangles, I'm sorry, I haven't been able to make an exact parallel here, it's much simpler. You can classify by the sides, isosceles, 2 sides the same, scalene, no sides the same, or equilateral, all sides the same length. And then within these, you can also classify by the angle type. So an equilateral triangle is necessarily acute, but isosceles or scalene triangles can then be acute, obtuse, or right. So to classify a triangle, you don't have to go as deep. You have to go at most 2 levels down into a hierarchy, and the options branching from isosceles and scalene are the same. So that's easier to represent. You can kind of chunk that idea of the angles at the same time. So anyway, the idea here is that maybe there's a difference in relational complexity between when we ask students to classify quadrilaterals versus triangles. And similarly, when we have any problem which just involves a whole number, well, this is 1 unit by itself. This is unary. On the other hand, once you get to a fraction like 5/7 here, this is at least binary. You cannot understand the fraction without relating the numerator to the denominator. And in fact, if we take this a step further, you can think about numerator and denominator as roles, and then about 5 and 7 as particular entities that are bound into the roles. Now it's interesting because 5 and 7 are actually abstract entities, right? They refer to like the set of everything that's 5 and the set of everything that's 7. But they also have, you know, object level properties. They're odd, they're prime. That would be like here. And what if we considered a fraction as a relation with this type of relational structure? A numerator role and a denominator role, and you can only understand it by understanding the roles of numerator and denominator and how they interact. Now you may be saying to yourself, well, that's all a very interesting idea, but do you have anything to back it up? Well, here's the reasoning. We'll say if fractions are hard because of their relational complexity, then greater relational reasoning ability should predict greater facility with fractions. So in other words, our research question is, does domain general relational reasoning ability predict fraction knowledge? How do we test this? Well, as Matthew mentioned, I'm very lucky to be working with these PIs at Hubbard and Percival Matthews, who launched this program, the Longitudinal Analysis of Mathematical Brain Development and Abilities. We're following two groups of students, one starting in 2nd grade and one starting in 5th grade. They're recruited from schools, different districts, and also we tried to recruit from community centers to increase the diversity of the sample. And the reason that we chose to start with 2nd graders and 5th graders, is that in most US curricula and in the Common Core standards, which some of the districts use, fractions are not introduced in any way in 2nd grade. But they are introduced in 3rd and 4th grade, and by 5th grade, there's a considerable amount of fraction concepts and procedures in the curriculum, including fraction arithmetic. So we want to contrast these, but we also get to follow them over time, which is nice. So the data I'm going to be presenting today is just from the first wave, the first year of participation, but stay tuned. You know, we're getting into the longitudinal stuff now as we've got more of the data coming in. Or we did, you know, until all human subjects data collection was halted. I mean, obviously it's good, it's right, but. So what do I mean by fraction knowledge assessment? We have what we call the fraction knowledge assessment. It's a paper and pencil test. The items are adapted from different standardized tests, including state tests, the TIMSS, probably not the PISA, but the NAEP. All the questions have to do with fractions in some way. Fractions, ratios, related concepts. There's a different version for each grade, a 2nd grade version and a 5th grade version. The difficulty is scaled for each grade. And one of the concrete ways that you can see that is that the 2nd grade version has very few fraction arithmetic items, whereas the 5th grade version, I think maybe a third of it is fraction arithmetic items. It has about 38 items total, which doesn't matter too much because I'll be presenting the proportion correct. Okay. Well, just to give you a little taste, here's an example of a 5th grade item. Estimate the sum of 12/13 and 7/8. So this is not necessarily an arithmetic item. This is actually asking students or participants to get in touch with that sense of a fraction's magnitude. About how big is 12/13? About how big is 7/8? And pick the answer here. Here's what I'm referring to as a fraction arithmetic item. This is just straight up arithmetic, no word problem, no context, but with fractions. For the 2nd graders, we had different types of items, although there are some of the same items for linking and scaling in the future. We haven't done that yet. But for example, the 2nd graders might be asked, circle the line with the larger fraction shaded. So between this line and this line, which one has a larger fraction shaded? So you can see this line has a larger absolute magnitude, but the fraction shaded is larger in this line. And there are also problems with symbolic fractions. Circle the larger fraction between 3/5 or 5/10. Okay. So this is what we're considering our measure of fraction knowledge or facility with fractions. How are we measuring relational reasoning? We are using the test of relational reasoning junior, which we obtained from these very nice people. There's an adult version of the tour, and the junior version is very similar to it. It actually has 4 subtests. We have chosen to focus on the analogy subtest partly because its reliability was a little bit better, but also because it's the clearest parallel to the type of relational reasoning that I've been talking about. Alexander and colleagues very rightly, I think, point out that relational reasoning is not simply analogy, that there are different types of relations that you can attend to and so forth. But for this study, we have just used the analogy subtest. So the scores possible are from 0 to 8. Here's an example item of what that actually looks like. The participants are given this set of figures and asked to choose one of these. And hopefully you're all thinking that A should be the correct answer, and you think, okay, you can think about this as a rule or a set of relations, shapes on this axis, number on this axis, and so forth. And you have to relate those two dimensions together. Okay, I feel like I'm missing a slide, but I think it's coming up. So let's just look at the bivariate correlation to start. Is there a relationship between fraction knowledge and relational reasoning? Yes. Here's the Tor Jr. analogy score. Here's the proportion correct on the FKA. Second graders, R of 0.49. Similar for the fifth graders. You can see it here. And here's a slide that I moved, sorry. So overall, our outcome measure is this fraction knowledge assessment, and our main predictor that we're interested in is this test of relational reasoning. But because this is such a great, huge study, we have a lot of variables that we can work with, including 2 experimental tasks that have to do with fraction magnitude, and I will talk more about those later. Some subtests of standardized tests, including the Woodcock-Johnson and the WISC. The calculation test has a number of math items that go from easy to hard, and basically the participants go as far as they can until the math is beyond them. Math fluency is a time test, and the problems are much simpler, so this is more like a math fact recall. Yeah. So the strategy here is to step through multiple regression models and consider some plausible alternative hypotheses and see if we can reject them. Right, so what we're thinking is relational reasoning specifically is important for fraction knowledge or fraction understanding because fractions are relational in a way that whole numbers are not. Here are the alternative hypotheses. Maybe smart kids are just smart, right? People who are good at one thing tend to be good at another thing. This is Spearman's G, if you believe in that. And then the other possibilities are, well, maybe relational reasoning contributes to math ability more broadly, and then math ability contributes to fraction ability. And then finally, maybe relational reasoning is helping participants or students understand the magnitude of fractions, and that's why it helps with fractions overall. So we're going to consider each of these hypotheses in turn. So the first one is probably the one that all of you guys thought of first. So yes, we observe this relationship between fractions and relational reasoning. It's a correlation, so we don't have a directionality or causality. But the question is there an obvious confound, such as being smart or being good at things? Could this be driving both of these? So obviously, the strategy is you control for the suspected confound and see if this relationship still exists. In this case, we made a composite out of the spatial reasoning, block design, and matrix reasoning subtests. We did a factor analysis. They all load nicely onto one factor with good, strong loadings. Then based on that factor, we made individual factor scores. And in the regression models, I refer to this as the nonverbal composite. So the nonverbal composite is actually the factor score based on all 3 of these scores. And part of the reason for that was, to be able to include these, to get multiple measures of a construct without eating up too many degrees of freedom. So controlling for work here, this is the nonverbal composite that I was just talking about. So this is made of the block design, spatial reasoning, and matrix reasoning. We also controlled for age and months and auditory working memory. We can see this is the second graders. When you add the TOR in, even when you control for these other factors, it's still a significant predictor. It has a pretty decent effect size considering everything that's in here. And it is contributing at least a little bit of unique variance, explaining unique variance in the fraction scores, right? The outcome here is the score on the fraction knowledge assessment, the percent correct. For the fifth graders, a similar pattern. Even when you control for these other things, the TOR relational reasoning still is a significant predictor, pretty good effect size, contributes unique variance, or explains unique variance. So we can move past this initial hypothesis. Let's move to the next one, which is the idea that maybe relational reasoning contributes to overall math ability, and that's why you see this relationship between relational reasoning and fractions. So here we added the math fluency and the calculation measures that we had. So this was a math factory call, and this is a little more nuanced mathematics ability. And for the second graders, relational reasoning stays significant, pretty strong, contributes unique variance. For the fifth graders, not quite, which is also interesting. Why might this be the case? In fact, and I have to thank one of our reviewers for naming this concept. We kind of had a sense of it, but not a specific name. There's something called Spearman's Law of Diminishing Returns, or SLOTR. Intelligence predicts novice performance better than expert performance, and there's some examples of this from the chess expertise literature, for example. If you think about it, it kind of makes intuitive sense, because as you become an expert in a domain, you have a schema, you have things you know, your expertise could even be considered to be a crystallized intelligence. So you're not depending as much on your fluid intelligence to solve problems in the domain. So in a sense, the fifth graders could be, compared to second graders, at least fraction experts. They have experience, they have crystallized knowledge about fraction arithmetic, which could include strategies and procedural strategies, like, okay, maybe I need to make a common denominator. So for this reason, this may be what's going on here, that as the fifth graders have more knowledge about fractions, they depend less. Yeah, you can see that here. No, not quite. They depend less on their relational reasoning ability to parse the fractions. So we've got that. We've got that. Sorry, I've gone a little slower than I thought. Well, almost done here though. Okay, what about this last point? This comes up. This is an idea from the numerical cognition literature, that there's been a lot of emphasis on helping students understand that fractions have magnitudes, that you can put them on a number line, that a fraction represents some quantity, and that understanding fractions in this sense may be the key to helping students perform better with fractions overall. And so maybe relational reasoning is helpful because it actually helps you get to that concept of fraction magnitude. And this is something that our labs work on a lot. We have two tasks in this study. One is a fraction number line estimation task. So the participants see a fraction and they're asked to place it somewhere on this number line. And then the measure is the percent absolute error. So basically, how far above or below the correct point in space were they? My colleagues are working on some analyses of these, both for children and for adults. And we also have a fraction magnitude comparison task. So basically the participants see two fractions and they just have to select which is the bigger of the fraction. And their overall accuracy is the measure that we're taking from that. If this is something that you're interested in, the idea of fraction magnitudes and how they might be different between second graders and fifth graders, and how they might be different if you are thinking about non-symbolic versus symbolic fractions, you may be interested in these papers. This one just came out in March. We're pretty excited about it in JCP, Experimental Child Psychology. And my colleague John Binzak, who actually designed this task, is working on an adult version, which you may be able to find on SciArchive. Okay. So these are the two measures that we controlled for in this example. And even when we control for these specific, I'm really sorry, I formatted my tables. I reformatted them at the last minute. Even when we control for these fraction magnitude measures, so the correlation with number line PAE is negative because this is your error amount as opposed to this one is your accuracy. Relational reasoning is still contributing something above and beyond the sense of magnitude, just the unidimensional magnitude of fractions. And that was an important point for me because I feel like stressing only the idea of fractions as a magnitude, what about the part-part relation, the ratio relation? And so this is kind of hinting that, yes, actually, there's something more going on than just magnitude for understanding fractions. Okay, well, so what? Does that tell us anything useful that we can do? Oh, sorry, that's the next slide. Summary, I'm just going to skip this because I think we all understand this. I think we're running short on time. Okay, so what? Well, one thing is, if we identify the relational structure and complexity of knowledge components, what can we do? One thing we can do is use instructional approaches that we know are helpful for learning relational concepts. There's metric tons of research supporting the idea that things like comparison, contrast, relational language, structural alignment can help learn relational concepts. If we identify what are the relational knowledge concepts and target them specifically using these strategies, that might be more effective than maybe some of the current strategies that are, or the fact that there isn't a uniform set of strategies. Regarding relational complexity, and since we know that it's related to working memory, what can we do knowing that, having identified a relational complexity of different knowledge components? Well, one thing is you could consider delaying more complex, more relationally complex knowledge components until later grades, when those frontal lobes have had a little more chance to mature. Or you can scaffold to support greater working memory demand. So for example, this is where the segmenting and chunking idea comes in. There's a reason you learn Boyle's law and Charles' law before you learn the ideal gas law, right? You get to play with only two variables at a time, so you get kind of a chunk of that before you put them all together. So that would be an idea of scaffolding, an example of scaffolding. And this may be a little more controversial, but maybe if you want to strengthen understanding of relational complex, can you improve relational reasoning ability in general? And we have at least a couple of examples, this one from Klingberg, that maybe you can. So some different ideas here. And you know, this is about just a quantitative sense of relational complexity. But one thing that I'd like to look at a little further too is kind of qualitative types of relational complexity. So for example, is it a tree structure? Is it a cycle? And then what instructional strategies specifically help you learn certain shapes, basically, of relational structures or schemas? So these are the kinds of things that I'm interested in and that I'd like to pursue in my future work. I want to say thank you to everyone who made these studies possible, the participants and their families, so many RAs who helped us collect the data, my colleagues Alex and Yunji for the number line data, the NIH, and yeah, if you are hiring, I am looking for a job. Either I'm interested in a postdoctoral position where I could kind of explore these issues more, or a junior faculty position where I could explore these issues more. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Priya, for that fascinating talk. If anybody has any questions, if you can put your virtual hands up, and then Margarita will invite you to ask your question. So whilst everybody, people are thinking, I'll start with a question. So in your data, it showed that year 5's relational reasoning appeared to be less predictive in your models, and you talked about this kind of expertise effect of learning schemas. So does that mean that, does that allude to relational reasoning being involved in the learning of the schemas then?
Oh yeah, I definitely think it could be. But what the TOR is measuring, I think, is more your ability to do relational reasoning kind of on the fly. And yeah, this is kind of an idea that I haven't completely developed in this talk, but maybe to facilitate this transition to experts, we should focus on explicitly teaching relational structures. So I think that kind of goes with what you're saying.
Cheers. Are you doing the questions, Margarita? Or there's a question from Alina, I think.
I do see a hand
Yes.
there, yeah.
We have a question, and everybody is now allowed. You can now unmute yourselves, so so that we can have a more flowing discussion. So if you have any questions, you can just go ahead and ask them.
Oh, thank you for a good talk. I was curious, I'm not super familiar with TOR Junior, and I was wondering what the difference between TOR Junior, analogy, and matrix reasoning is, since the matrix reasoning task is also an analogy task.
Right, yeah, and that's definitely a concern for a lot of people. If you look at a matrix reasoning task, and I've taken a look at some specific items, they are not all relational. They're not all, based on analogies. Some of them are based more on feature comparison or other types of pattern recognition, whereas the items on the TOR, I think, distill a little bit more just items that are focusing on abstract relations. At least that's been my interpretation. And yeah, I mean, going into this, we had a lot of expectation that this was just going to double what we were getting from the matrix reasoning, and that was a little bit of a surprise for us too. Good
Thanks.
question.
Can I just ask about the TOR? Does the score, is it a metric of more difficulty in the items?
Yes, the items do get harder as you go through yeah, from 0 to 8. 8 is the hardest.
And how do they get harder? Is there?
That is a good question. I haven't looked at the actual items in a little while, but I would venture that they may involve more dimensions than you have to integrate. So greater relational complexity. Don't quote me on that. I have to check. Good question. Yeah.
We have a question from Leonard.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Thank you for this nice talk, Priya. I really enjoyed it. I really liked most of it, but I strongly disagree with one of your suggestions in the end. You said that relational complexity requires greater working memory. So it might make sense to postpone more complex concepts to later stages in school. But why couldn't it be the other way around, that working memory development requires relational complexity? So that's, from my point of view, the whole thing of schooling. You confront students with stuff which is slightly above what they can do. So how do you get to this suggestion?
It's a lovely Vygotskian perspective, if I may say so.
Yes.
I also just want to say I love your paper with Micah Goldwater from a couple of years ago. I'm a big fan. Relational concepts as a bridge to education. Yeah, so I'm willing to walk that one back a little bit. That's one way that you could interpret the findings as an implication. But I agree with you. If you want to try and pull students up a little bit into their zone of proximal development, maybe scaffold the relational complexity. And that was my second bullet point. Don't just throw them in the deep end, but provide a framework for that. And that is something that I'm actually very interested in, the extent to which introducing relational concepts and allowing students to develop abstract representations can actually help them learn across domains. I haven't been able to get into that empirically yet, but that is a perspective I take. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks.
Thank you.
Priya, I had to arrive late, so I've been sitting quietly, but I have to come in and agree with that I have exactly the same, well, I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but that if you have relational concepts, especially those are, let's say, high-order relations that pull together sets of relations, then you can actually fit more into the same old working memory. You know, it's like a fancier version of chunking. And so
yeah, exactly.
Exactly. So the idea that you just mentioned, that part of training is giving the kind of representations that allow the same old working memory to do a lot more work. I think that's a really nice idea. And by the way, I would put in a picture of relational language as one of the things that supports that.
Yeah, I should have put a citation. It's so great to have you here. Thank you. Did I answer the question adequately?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. Great to see you. Hiro, I'm sorry.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you, Priya, for your excellent presentation. I'm kind of, you know, the thing about representations about number lines, fractions in number lines. So you say that rational reasoning has an effect on learning fraction, right? But did you research about whether relational reasons makes this integration between symbolic and not symbolic representations of fractions? This is one question. And the other one, if you did say about that non-symbolic representation, number lines, relational reasoning has an effect on learning fractions. What would be the role in, you know, in the kids? They see the fraction, the true variable representation, and what they do. What is the role of relational reasoning in answering the actual question? Thank you, Priya.
Great, thank you. Yeah, the first question is interesting. We do definitely have several lines of research in the lab that are considering the relationship between symbolic and non-symbolic representations of fractions. But, excuse me, Charlie. Sorry. Yeah. But we haven't specifically looked at how relational reasoning contributes to that relationship between symbolic and non-symbolic. That's interesting. Can you say a little more about why you think that might be the case, so I can pitch this to my boss?
Yeah, I had some experience when I am trying to use analogy to make that integration, for example, in fractions in particular. So we try to teach kids with kind of bars like this. So the fractions are there in the presentation, and we say, look, this is bigger than this other one because this is here and the other one is here. So we give number line representations together with symbolic representations. And we expect, for example, that the analogy works something like this. Let me show you a diagram I have here. Sorry, just give me a little bit of time.
Yeah, while you're pulling that up, I guess I can say that, yeah, in terms of, how specifically is relational reasoning operating when a student is considering a fraction and integrating the numerator and denominator, the way I think of it is that if you, as a student, have this abstract representation of the relation, what a numerator is, how it relates to a denominator, how they can interact with each other, then once you know something about one specific fraction, let's say 1/4, that you say, oh, okay, one way to think about this is 1 out of 4. Then when you meet somebody a little more exotic, like 5/7, you might say, okay, so this is 5 parts out of 7. So however you understand that numerator and denominator rule, that you can apply it regardless of what the specific magnitudes are in those rules.
So for example, you could make this operation in concrete objects, like you put together two of those bars, and you get the sum of fractions, something like this. This could be an analogy that you make to try to integrate the concrete object manipulation with the symbolic
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
representation of fractions. And the same might be true with comparison. So you make the child to perceive the objects, and if you present together with that the symbolic representation, maybe you are helping to make that blend of representations.
Can you create the alignment between the non-symbolic and the symbolic representations? And then if a student is more apt at relational reasoning, they're more able to do the structural alignment. That's very interesting. Yeah.
So I was thinking that maybe you have some, in your research, you might have, make some analysis to see if the relational knowledge has some.
I can definitely look into that with the data that we have.
Yeah.
Feel free to send me an email later and we can talk about that.
I would love to.
Yeah, great.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any more questions at all? Maybe? If I could ask another question, actually.
Yeah, sure.
So, similar to the previous question, when I think of relational reasoning, these notions of like base and target come to mind, where there's a relational structure is abstracted from a base and then used some kind of scaffold or some transfer and inference is made to learning. And I'm wondering what kind of, if that's involved in learning fractions, what kind of concept bases might be used to kind of as the scaffold. So again, what Jairo was just presenting might have been one, for instance.
Right. That would have been my first answer. It's like, well, maybe you make this mapping from a non-symbolic representation to a symbolic representation. But I guess I do also want to push back a little bit on the idea of that it has to be a base to target mapping, because you could potentially learn a relational concept. You have to induce that, right, over several examples. So maybe it's more a process of relational induction rather than mapping from base to target. So that's how I think about it too, because at some point, you have to learn the relation in the base.
True.
And how do you do that without, going bases all the way down?
Thank you.
Just to chip in, yeah, absolutely. We talk about a process that we call mutual alignment, which came as sort of a big surprise to me. In fact, I think Ken Kurtz and I were among, I think way back, that was one of the things that we ran into, that you just put two things together. This is for adults, and it was two problems involving heat transfer. They don't have a clue about either of them, which we can tell when we have subject describe what's going on in the two scenarios. But when you put them together and make people compare them, especially if you also have to say what goes with what, the more intensive the comparison, the better. They get that they're both about heat transfer and they differ in a significant way. I think a lot of learning, especially with kids, especially with beginning learners, does not actually come from a known base where you pick up the relational structure and map it across. That was my original model, but we have moved more and more to thinking that a lot of really interesting learning, of course we do that a lot, and adults have a lot of knowledge that they can use in just that way. But I think the most interesting stuff happens when you put two things together and something emerges that you would not have seen.
Right. Right, exactly. Thank you so much for that. Yeah. So yes, so instead of having a base and a target, having two examples, and then from being able to see that multiple entities can take those roles, you can kind of shake the abstract representation free of the specifics. That's kind of how I think of it. And
yeah, and I think it's a gradual process. It will still be as context dependent as it can be in some sense.
Right, right. And that's one thing I wonder about is structuring examples to facilitate that. That's something I'm very interested in. I have another line of work which is less related to real curricular objects, but we're thinking about computationally. Let's say you take a feature vector representation, then the idea of abstraction is dropping out the specific perceptual features and keeping or putting more weight on the relational features. So I've got some experiments that I'm trying to do on that.
I mean, so these relational features, I mean, what are they? Do they bind to anything?
Well, that's been the issue that I've gotten a lot of pushback on. Yeah, the question about binding and how to represent that.
The feature vector at all.
Right, right. Since they are higher order, you do have to initially build them somehow out of the perceptual features. I'm just dipping my toes in there.
I think there are issues, but of course, stuff is happening all the time with these giant, models, and so I don't want to. It's important to keep an open mind, but I don't. It seems like if it's a relation, it's got to bind to arguments, at least even if it's not conscious, to the user, there has to be that binding.
Yeah. Or can you hold the relation with open slots, with open variables somehow, abstractly?
Of course you can. I mean, that would be an abstract relation. Because the assembly
right
takes two things, an X and a Y. But if there's no, but one of them is the revolver and the other is the
right. Where it's not commutative. Yeah, exactly. And that's why my little experimental paradigm, the relations are all commutative to start with.
I'm setting up. I'll stop.
No, that's thank you. Yeah, no, it's.
Brilliant, thank you. Do we have any more questions at all? Anybody?
If there's still time for one more thing, this is less of a question, but something that I just thought about, fractions that's really interesting is in addition to each, like the numerator and denominator being slots that can be bound into, I think sometimes there's an unseen third slot, which is if you're considering a fraction of something, that what that whole is also, it's of one, but I think that in the second grade examples that you gave where you have like kind of a box and there's a fraction of that box that is shaded, and as you saw in that example in those slides, that whole is different, but what is important is that relation between what is shaded and not. So even though the denominator is that whole, I think sometimes there's a loss in the connection, or like a mapping between that fraction and the representation of a whole in that spatial relation. So I think that there's like kind of another layer also of abstraction that gets lost when we think about just numerical fractions.
Yeah, I think that totally makes sense. You, on the one hand, have the ratio of, for example, the shaded part to the non-shaded part, but then you also have, for example, the ratio of the shaded part to the whole line. Yeah, and a good point. And in fact, if you know the Thompson, I think, and Opfer and Siegler paper, they actually do try to align number lines of different scales, and I think they're trying to push on that idea. The title is something like, how is 15 cherries like 15,000 cherries? I can send you a link if you're interested. Yeah, but I think what you're saying totally makes sense.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Priya, for that fascinating talk, and to everybody for their questions and the interesting discussion. Please do join us next week as we have Professor Kenneth Forbes, who's going to be talking about analogy in cognitive architecture. So that's going to be a very interesting talk. But yeah, thank you for joining us for our first session. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Margarita.